Hi, I'm Dave Lenander, and this is TV Bookshelf. I'm with the Rivendell Group, which is a monthly discussion group that talks about myth, fantasy, and imaginative literature. And today I'm talking with one of the founder members of Rivendell, Ruth Berman, who has written quite a few things over the years and is receiving today at Arcana the Minnesota Fantasy Award. Ruth, your career begins a few years back as a fanzine editor originally, I think, and letter writer. Do you want to talk about how that grew into this long career?
I suppose I was a writer before I knew how to write, because I remember making up a poem in the train on a trip to Florida about how beautiful the Florida landscape outside the train window was. And since I didn't know how to write, I told the poem to my oldest brother, who wrote it down for me.
Which is your oldest brother?
My oldest brother is David.
Okay.
He tended to figure that he was the father of the younger ones, so I assumed that I could ask him to do that sort of thing, and he would, and he did. And then I started making up stories. I think probably many kids do this, and told the stories to myself and never told them to anybody else. And in high school I met Eleanor Arneson, who also was making up stories that she told herself. And when we realized that we were doing this was a very strong bond. And I started towards the end of high school writing my stories down, and what I was writing down was just terrible. And through college I went on writing stories and poems, and the stories were just terrible. So at the end of college, undergraduate college, I looked at what I'd got and I said, well, I'm clearly not a fiction writer. I just can't do this. But the poems, yeah, I said, the poems are pretty good and they're getting better. This is promising, I'll go on with that. So I did that for a couple of years, and then Star Trek came along. And with Star Trek, all of a sudden, I was thrown back into my storytelling mode. I couldn't watch Star Trek episodes and not make up more stories about these people, especially because at the time I was in graduate school and taking a seminar in Middle English. And some of the topics that people came up with were not all that specialized, but way more specialized than I could handle. There was a friend of mine in the seminar who wrote a paper on medieval church architecture. And she mentioned a nave, and I said, what is a nave? And she told me. And then she mentioned an apse, and I said, well, what is an apse? And she told me, and I realized, wait a moment, I don't know ABC in this topic. I'm not going to listen to this paper. I'm not going to understand it. So I didn't. I started writing down one of my Star Trek stories that I'd been telling myself. And my friend, reading her paper, looked over at what I was doing and got a funny expression on her face, but she didn't object. She was a nice person. And this Star Trek story that I was writing seemed rather promising. So I went on writing it, and I finished it, and I looked it over and I said, hey, that's a pretty good story. I guess I can write fiction after all. So then I published that story in Deborah Langston's Star Trek fanzine, Spockanalia. And a few years later I looked at it again and said, yeah, but it's not just a Star Trek story. I could leave out the Star Trek characters, put in other characters, the crew of a jet plane. It would still be a story, and I could sell it. So I did that, and it sold. It was the first story that I sold professionally.
What was the title?
Ptolemaic Hijack.
Oh, yes.
The characters are hijacked into the Ptolemaic universe of Spencer's Fairy Queen.
And that's been true of a lot of your fiction. You take ideas partly from literature and put them together in kind of interesting ways.
Yes, a lot of my stories start out from other people's stories. And some people saying that feel called upon to apologize and feel that they should be more original. But I don't feel that. I feel that you get excited by what you get excited by. You start telling a story about it, and by the time you finish telling the story, it's going to be your story.
So you went on writing more stories.
So I went on writing more stories, and at the same time continuing to write the poems. And also, during this time, I was in graduate school. I was writing papers for classes, and I was assuming that I was going to wind up being a college teacher and having to do scholarship. Well, I didn't wind up being a college teacher. There were no jobs available when I came out. But I wound up being a scholar. Although as a scholar, I'm very much a science fiction fan, fantasy fan. There's not that much difference between the articles I write for fanzines and the articles that I write that turn up in academic journals, because I'm usually writing about something that's happened in fantasy fiction or in science fiction, or often in children's fiction, because that's another area where I'm where I've been doing a lot of work. And it doesn't actually matter to me very much whether I'm telling inside jokes that only fans will get or whether I have to leave out the inside jokes and concentrate on the ideas.
When I first became aware of fandom, I became aware of Tolkien fandom, and I joined the Tolkien Society. And I remember seeing your letters before I even realized that you lived in the same metro area I did, both in Tolkien Journal and Mythprint and those sorts of journals, and also in Unicorn and some of the other things that I started to see. You were involved in Tolkien fandom, and you did, for instance, the Middle-earth Songbook, and I know you did No for, with your sister. It was originally New, and then it became No.
That's right. I cut the title in half when Gene stopped working on it, and I couldn't cut it to the other half because Us would have been New.
Right.
So to cut New in half, I had to come out with No.
And you also did T-Negative with all the Star Trek materials. You continued to write your own stories along the way, and I know at one point you became a guest of honor at one of the early mini-cons.
Yes. I just had a story that appeared in Analog, and Al Kufeld, now Ellen Kufeld, had an article in, I think that was Analog also, at about the same time, so we were jointly the guests of honor that year.
It was a lot smaller in those days.
Yes, it was a lot smaller. It made sense at the time to have as guests of honor somebody who'd had a couple of short stories published and somebody else who'd had a couple of articles published. Now it would sound rather odd to select that kind of career for a guest of honor at a minicon. But at the time it seemed reasonable.
And now actually you've written so many stories it wouldn't be so odd again.
No, it would still be very odd because I don't write enough of any one kind of thing to be noticed. If you make up a list of Minnesota science fiction writers, I'm not on that list. Make up a list of Minnesota poets, I'm not on that list. Minnesota scholars, I'm not on that list. You have to make up a list of Minnesota science fiction poets before you get to something narrow enough for me to count as having written enough to qualify to be worth mentioning. And yet when you add up all these different kinds of things, it does add up to a lot of work, and work that I feel was worth doing.
Now I have had a web page up for you for a number of years, and I've gotten more varied inquiries over the years as a result of having that up. Someone looking for the Middle-earth Songbook, someone asking, could this possibly be the same Ruth Berman that was my TA back in, I don't know, the early 70s or something? Another one saying, I read this article about heraldry. That couldn't be the same Ruth Berman you're talking about. Well, of course, it's all the same Ruth Berman.
Yeah, the heraldry is actually a rather large part of what I do because for some reason I find that heraldry is a way into character for me. If I'm writing a story and I'm stuck in a story, well, all people writing stories who get stuck are likely to say, well, I'll think about the character's background. I'll think about the character's childhood and the character's appearance and what clothes the character wants to wear. And for me, very often thinking about what coat of arms does the character bear is a way to get back into what's going on.
Did you ever do a Star Trek coat of arms series?
No, not exactly, but the Star Trek story set in Spencer's universe includes the coats of arms of the Spencerian knights who were running around.
Let's talk about some of the bigger projects that you undertook, more recent ones mostly. I guess Dear Poppa and...
Yes, Dear Poppa was another direction entirely for me, and yet it felt as if it was fitting in with what I did anyway, because I'm interested in children's literature, especially children's fantasy literature. And you could say, oh yes, you like children's fantasy literature because you like fantasy, which is true, but also I like children's literature because children see the world freshly. They are surprised by it and aware that it is surprising in a way that adults forget. So when you're thinking about children's literature, including realistic children's literature, non-fantasy material, you're still getting a take that makes you think in different ways from the ways you were thinking before, a take that will surprise you in the way that fantasy will surprise you. And so to me it feels like kind of the same thing when I'm studying children's literature or when I'm studying fantasy literature. But in this case with Dear Poppa, what I've got is literature by children, because my father served in World War II. He was overseas for 2.5 years when I was a baby. And my mother would call my older brothers and my older sister around the typewriter every few days and say to them, what do you want to tell Papa? And they would dictate to her, and she would type for them, and she typed these long, long letters where they poured their hearts out and exposed themselves in ways that children don't normally do, because it's not that easy for them to write things down. I think my favorite letter in the book is the letter that my oldest brother, David, wrote about playing croquet with Sammy. Now, of course, he's Sam. He wouldn't answer to Sammy. And he said, Sammy got angry, and he was coming at me, so I took the head off my croquet mallet, and I hit him on the head. I didn't think it was hard, but he cried. Poor little thing. But you know, Pop, I would rather hit Sammy than have Sammy hit me. Adults know better than to say things like that. Children will expose themselves and make you aware, yes, that's how we all feel. And having put these letters together, I said, well, who will want these? Minnesota Historical Society. And sure enough, Minnesota Historical Society said, yes, they would like to publish these letters. They pointed out that there was no such collection. Children can't normally write letters like that. It needs some adult to provide assistance. So there is no book of what children were saying during the war. There is one book that a scholar put together of interviewing people who were children during the war. And this is their adult recollections looking back. William Tuttle's book, quite a fascinating book. But it's not the immediate understanding of children. It's adults remembering what they thought about the war. Whereas Dear Papa is the letters that the three children wrote to their father and his answers, and also my mother's letters, which often were letters about the children and what they were saying and doing. So you get a portrait of a family in wartime, which is something that hadn't been available before.
Were these letters that you had seen before this project over the years?
I'd seen them once in a while. I knew that there was a box in the closet that had all these letters in them, and a couple of times I'd tried to read the letters, but the handwriting varies from bad to really terrible. And a couple of times I thought, there's a book in those letters somewhere, and then I would look at them and think, that's impossible. And then along came the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and two of my nephews were assigned by their high schools to write some kind of thing about World War II, and they went to my father and said, tell us about what you did in World War II. And he said, well, let's look at these letters. By then the letters had been given to the Minnesota Historical Society, so we didn't pull them out of the closet. We went over to the Historical Society, looked at them there, and I looked at them again, first with one nephew, then with the other nephew, and again I said, there's a book in there somewhere, and now I've got a computer with a word processing program. And with the computer, it became possible to do this because I could take a letter in my father's terrible handwriting and type up as much of it as I could read, and then look at it again and say, oh yes, here's what that word is, here's what that sentence is. And then I could print that off, take it home, show it to my father, say, okay, what's that word, what's that sentence? And instead of having to retype the whole thing each time when I made changes, I could just let the computer fit it all together. And it became possible to type those manuscript letters up in a way that I just couldn't have done on a typewriter.
It's interesting to think about. The computer actually makes it possible in a funny way. You also collected essays from the Kerlan Award winners. Do you want to explain what that is?
I've been interested in the Kerlan collection of children's literature at the University of Minnesota for many years, since I was in high school when I first heard about it. It's a wonderful resource. Irvin Kerlan was a doctor who worked with, I think, the Food and Drug Administration in a high-pressure job, put him under a lot of tension, and his doctor said to him one day, you need a relaxing hobby. So Kerlan said, children's literature, that would be a relaxing hobby, except it wasn't, not the way he did it. He started going around to every major children's literature writer, every major children's literature illustrator, saying, could I have your manuscripts? Could I have the originals of your drawings? I want to build up this collection. So he did. It was a collection that allowed students to come and look at the development of a story from the writer's first draft through second and however many other drafts, through the publisher's dummy copy, through the illustrator's rough drafts of illustrations, through the finished illustrations, through the published book. You could look at the whole development in a way that there aren't many collections that make that possible, but the Kerlan collection does. And when the Kerlan collection was about 25 years old, the curator, Karen Nelson Hoyle, came up with an interesting idea to help boost the Kerlan collection of giving an award each year. An award to somebody who was outstanding as a writer or illustrator of children's literature, and, this is the kicker, who had donated a lot of material to the collection.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a large enough number to allow for a wide range of quite wonderful authors and illustrators. And when the winners came to collect their awards, there would be a lunch or a dinner or a brunch, and the winner would give a speech. And the Kerlan collection sort of collected those speeches and sort of kept thinking, someday we will publish these. And when the 25th anniversary came around, they said, well, we really should. And one of the Kerlan board members, Betty Peltola, said to me, would you like to edit it? And I said, oh, wow, yes. My impression was that it would be easy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't easy because they hadn't collected the speeches systematically. They had about half a dozen of the speeches of about 25 winners. So the problem was then, okay, what are we going to do with these others? So we started looking. I wrote to Jane Yolen, and I said, Jane Yolen is a very systematic person. She'll have kept a copy of her speech. But she's more systematic than that. She wrote back to me, no, the Kerlan collection does have my speech, it's just not in the Kerlan Award file. It's in the file with the book that I was talking about. So sure enough, that's where her speech was, and that took care of that. Then there was another author who wrote back, well, I'm terribly sorry, I just don't have a copy. She sent me that as a letter. Before the letter came, I got an email from her saying, ignore letter, I found the speech. I didn't have a paper copy, but I had it on my computer still.
Yeah, computers to the rescue again.
Yes.
And you have a number of other stories like that.
Mm-hmm. And then there were some writers or illustrators who did not have speeches, but we were able to substitute other things to represent them. Wanda Gogg couldn't make a speech. She died. It was a posthumous award. But while she was alive, she'd written an autobiographical sketch that she would send out whenever anyone asked us, tell us something about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And Kerlan had collected a copy of that sketch. And the executor of Wanda Gogg's estate, her nephew, Gary Hum, said, yes, go ahead and publish that. And I said to Gary, and do you have the speech that actually was given at that awards banquet? Wanda was dead, but her sister Flavia gave a quite fascinating speech. I especially remember she told an anecdote about how their cat would twang on a wire outside the screen to let them know, open the door, let me in. Gary said, well, I'll look. And he found it. He said, well, it doesn't have a title on it, but it does have the story about the cat. It must be the right speech. So Flavia Gogg's speech about her sister Wanda Gogg is in the book, as well as Wanda Gogg's self-portrait.
I'd like to just mention, because there isn't much time, your Bradamant stories, and mention how much I've enjoyed them and how much I found that after reading a number of them, I realized that the overall story is about family. And it's about dragons.
Well, I wouldn't have thought of that, but I guess that
things.
is one of the things it's about, now that you mention it.
And so I do see a certain continuity between your stories about your childhood, well, really not your childhood, your siblings' childhood, although I'm sure it reflects your childhood a little bit later on when your dad was back from the war. And all this work you've done with children's literature, all the poetry you've written.
Yeah, the Bradamant stories make up a novel, which so far is not sold, although I hope it may. Two of the stories have been published now as stories just by themselves. I took out from the magazine versions the references ahead and back to other events in the whole novel. And Bradamant is a character, again, this is other people's work influencing me. Bradamant is a character in two Italian epics about Charlemagne. The Italian poets were themselves reacting to somebody else's work. They were reacting to the French legends, to the Song of Roland. So Tasso wrote, not Tasso, Boiardo wrote Orlando in Love, and Ariosto wrote Orlando Running Wild, Orlando Gone Crazy. And when I read these in translation, I said, gee, I like the character Bradamant in these stories. I wish there were more stories about Bradamant. She's interesting. And I can write more stories about her. Just because there aren't any more doesn't mean I can't write more, and I did.
And I guess we could just mention the poetry. Actually, you've already read poetry in this TV Bookshelf series. along with some other science fiction poetry writers.
Yes, there's a group of us here in Minneapolis and St. Paul and Rochester who writes science fiction and fantasy poetry, and we get together once a month as a workshop to critique each other's work. And occasionally at science fiction conventions we read as the lady poetesses from hell.
Mm-hmm. And last year you received the Science Fiction Poetry Award, the Riesling, wasn't it?
Yes, the Science Fiction Poetry Association gives an annual award for the best long and best short science fiction or fantasy poem published that year, nominated and voted on by the membership. And I won with
Potherb
Gardening, a poem about a witch's feeling about her witchcraft garden.
We've been talking with Ruth Berman today on TV Bookshelf. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David.
Next up, the Minnesota Fantasy Awards presentation, which is offered annually by Arcana to a person with a strong connection to Minnesota who's made a distinguished contribution to science fiction, fantasy, or horror at some point in their career. Amira Keidemann. This year the award is going to Ruth Berman. I'm going to start by reading an abbreviated portion of my write-up for our program book. Conceived in Texas, born in 1942 in Kentucky, Ruth Berman has lived most of her life in Minnesota, currently in the metro area. Ruth's family believed in reading out loud to one another, exposing her at an early age to many imaginative writers, including Shakespeare, Lewis Carroll, and L. Frank Baum. At University of Minnesota High School, she befriended fellow SF aficionados Eleanor Arneson, Barry Hansen, and Ron White, all of whom went on to write professionally. Hansen is Dr. Demento. Ruth received a PhD from the University of Minnesota in 1979. Her thesis was Suspending Disbelief, the Development of Fantasy as a Literary Genre in 19th Century British Fiction, and has taught freshman English at the U of M and the University of Oklahoma. Ruth edited a fanzine in high school in the late 50s, edited the early Star Trek fanzine T-Negative in the 60s, began contributing letters and articles first to fanzines and to scholarly publications in the early 60s, topics ranging from Baker Street to Oz, and since the early 70s has been publishing poetry and short fiction in an extremely wide range of magazines and anthologies, including Saturday Review, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, New Worlds, Asimov Science Fiction, Analog, Amazing Stories, Weird Tales, Tales of the Unanticipated, Xanadu 3, edited by Jane Yolen, and Time Frames, edited by Terry A. Gary. Her Potherb Gardening in the Asimovs won the 2003 Riesling Award for Best Short Poem. A recent fiction publication is The Broken Sword in the June 2004 Asimovs. She has served as poetry editor for Mythos and Pandora. Some books that bear her name are the Middle-earth Songbook, 1976, co-edited with Ken Nahian, Dear Poppa, the World War II Berman Family Letters, 1997, consisting of the letters Ruth's older siblings dictated and her mother typed to her father while he was served overseas. Autumn World, a collaborative science fiction novel written with Joan Marie Verba, Tess Smira, Deborah K. Jones, and Margaret Howes. Kerlan Awards in Children's Literature, 1975 to 2001, published 2001. Edited by Ruth and consisting of the acceptance speeches by award recipients. And Syzygic and Other Surprises, 2003, a children's author, Ruth Plumley Thompson collection, edited by Ruth and Douglas G. Green. Ruth Berman's fiction and poetry, lyrical and thoughtful, are often meditations on literature and life and how they interact. Her contributions to fantasy aren't confined to print. She has lent her learned, witty presence to many SF conventions and organizations. She joined the Minnesota Science Fiction Society in the late 60s and was a signatory to its 1972 Constitution. She attended the first meeting of the fantasy book discussion Rivendell Group in or around December 1973 and remains a regular participant in that group's discussions a remarkable 31 years later. In 1974, she and Eleanor Arneson founded an SF writing group that, subsequently named the Aardvark Writing Group, also continues to meet. In a Ruth Berman page on the internet, the major source in all things Berman, editor David Lenander writes, when Ruth helped start the Rivendell discussion group, I soon became the chief organizer of the monthly meetings and editor of the newsletter. But there was never any question that Ruth was naturally first among equals in our discussions of fantasy literature. When she taught English at the University of Oklahoma, scarcely a meeting would pass here in Minneapolis without someone observing, apropos some literary mystery, well, Ruth would know. So at this point I'd like to ask Ruth Berman to come up.
I did a little
It's a beautiful award, and I'm very proud and pleased to have it. Thank you. Should I say anything?
Sure.
I've been having a very curious career, if career is quite the right word for it. If you look at lists of Minnesota, and fill in a thing I do, if you look at lists of Minnesota science fiction and fantasy writers, you won't see my name. And if you look at lists of Minnesota poets, you won't see my name. And if you look at lists of Minnesota scholars, you won't see my name. You have to get really narrow. If you say Minnesota science fiction poets, yes, there you will see my name. I never seem to write enough of any one thing to be counted, except, of course, science fiction poetry. And yet, I almost have the feeling in the different things I do that somehow they're the same thing. I couldn't tell you how poetry and fiction and academic articles are the same thing, and yet for me somehow they are. I've even got another category to add in here because occasionally I translate French fantasy, and Wildside Press will be doing in print-on-demand editions 2 volumes that I translated from the fiction of Charles Nodier, who was a writer at the time of the French Revolution and wrote some quite fascinating fantasies. I'm very happy that those will be coming out sometime. I heard just yesterday that Wildside's going to do that. Well, thank you.